So the first question I have for you is, you began your Camino with a romantic and a rather idealistic idea of what the Camino should be. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little anecdote about your pilgrim staff, which encapsulated that sort of initial view.
Okay, so this goes back, in fact, about 3 years before I walked the Camino. I was in Galicia with my wife, and I'm a filmmaker, so most years we go to the Cannes Film Festival. So we decided that we would go drive from from Galicia to Cannes. And I saw all these people walking, and I realized that they were walking on this thing called the Camino de Santiago, and it started to intrigue me. I started then to sort of coordinate the drive to the south of France, following as much as I could the route of the Camino in the car, because I became more and more fascinated by these crazy people walking across Spain. And I remember stopping in a small village, and it was a stop along the way on the Camino, and there were all these pilgrims sitting around outside this cafe, a beautiful, beautiful sunny morning. And it just sort of grabbed my heart. And so I remember walking into a market store there, and I saw these pilgrim staffs for sale. I went to this one pilgrim staff that was kind of like, I described it later as gnarled and knobbly. It was kind of like, it was sort of real and authentic. And I bought this staff for like about €8 or something. Yeah. And I put it in the car, even though it was a bit inconvenient to put a big walking staff in this car as we were driving. And then when I came back from Cannes, back to this little village that we were staying in Galicia, I started walking with this staff. And I thought, I'm going to walk this Camino. Part of this notion of walking the Camino was tied up with this very authentic looking walking staff. I wasn't allowed to bring it back on the plane. So when I came back to Australia, and we live in Mudgee, which is a small country town northwest of Sydney, I found an equivalent staff, a branch, which I kind of whittled into this pilgrim staff. And I started training around here. Well, my wife thought that I was crazy. My whole family thought I was crazy because they never, ever thought that I would walk the Camino, but I became more and more obsessed with it. And part of this obsession sort of rested with this staff. When I finally did make the big decision to walk the Camino, and I landed in Biarritz, I got a taxi share to St. John Peter Paul. Yeah. And the first thing I did was I wanted to find a staff that replicated, that staff that I'd originally bought in that small village in Spain, and the staff that I had in Mudgee. And I went from place to place to place in St. John Peter Paul, and they had all of these sort of very kind of clinical, cold, manufactured, what I call broomsticks. Yeah. I drove the shopkeepers crazy trying to find exactly what I wanted. And I finally found something that suited the purpose. But the problem was, what I didn't realize was that it was totally inappropriate for walking a Camino. I had knee issues pretty much from day one going up to Roncesvalles, across the Pyrenees. And my knee gave out. By the time I got to Pamplona, I was in a real state. My knee was swollen up to the size of half a watermelon. And a friend that I'd met on the Camino said to me, if you want to finish the Camino, there's no way you can do it with this silly staff. You've got to get walking sticks. Well, walking sticks were walking poles, these sort of metallic titanium sort of walking poles were anathema to me of the romantic pilgrim. They were cold. They made this clack clack sound. They were just horrible.
It ended up being one of your first lessons, didn't it? That you had to.
A huge lesson, Sarah, because this guy took me to a department store in Pamplona, and he demonstrated how you walk with them. And I tried it, and he said, and he was absolutely correct, if I wanted to complete the Camino on my bad knee, then I had to take on walking poles. To answer your question, that was a big lesson, because I was faced with this dilemma. Do I continue to hold on to this notion of the romance of the pilgrim, or do I face the practicalities of walking at that point, something like 700 kilometers on a bung knee? And now I tell you what, I would not walk 2 blocks without walking poles.
I agree with you, I must admit. And this recurring issue of your knee, you know, is evident all the way through the story that you've written. And that one of your initial friends lent you a towel to administer ice, and then this idea of returning his towel sort of pushed you forward. I'm wondering, do you think that positively or negatively or both impacted your journey?
Look, it's actually a very, very complicated kind of thing, because what happened was he was one of the people that when I had a taxi share from Biarritz Airport to St. Jean Pied de Port, he was in the taxi. And so we became friends just simply from that taxi ride. And we stayed in the same albergue in St. Jean Pied de Port before we headed off. I lost track of him when we began the first few days. I met up with him just going into Pamplona. He saw that I was in a huge amount of pain, and he said, look, come to this albergue and we'll get your knee sorted. So he organized ice, and he iced my knee with this towel, which was a high-tech, very expensive, high-tech sort of walking, hiking towel. And then he took me to the department store, convinced me that I should get these poles. And then the next morning, he and his mate left. And I was left in Pamplona basically to recuperate. And he thought, that's the end. You know, this bloke can never finish the Camino. But I was determined to finish it. And here's where it becomes complicated, because I thought, this fellow has very generously given me his towel on the basis that I should use it to ice my knee and get better. The towel's probably worth 80 to 100 euro. I mean, it was that kind of expensive towel. And I thought, no, I've got to give this towel back to him. And that became kind of like my reason for continuing. But I think it's more complicated in that I think, you know, as I discuss in the book, you know, it's like, all right, I was about to turn 60. Am I sort of using this towel excuse to convince myself that I'm not old, that I'm not past it? You know, it's not one sort of very simple kind of thing. It's a much more complicated thing than that. I have so many Camino friends now, and I've since walked 4 more Caminos. And one of the things that I've learned is that there's no need to rush. If you do take your time, then you don't have those continuing friendships with people, you know, that are walking at a regular kind of pace. If you're walking at a regular kind of pace, you crisscross with these people throughout the Camino. And then if you're fortunate, you get to the end at Santiago, and they're there, and you share the experience with them. If you go slower, then those people go on ahead, and you don't have that continuing kind of interaction of friendship as you go.
Perhaps you have interaction with the slower people.
Well, that's right. But you know, if I was to do the Camino de Santiago, the Camino Frances again, there's no doubt that I will go slower. I think that there's so much more to gain by going slower.
So that sort of leads us to this idea of your PGS and how learning to trust it became an important part of your Camino journey. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Look, I'm a filmmaker, and I've made movies most of my life, big budget feature films. But something happened while I was making a thriller with Burt Reynolds in New Orleans. I had an incident where I was driving to the airport early one morning. It was dark. In fact, I was in a hurry to get to the airport. I was running late. There was an intersection up ahead, a green light. I went to accelerate, and a voice said, slow down. But that's weird. I went to accelerate again. The voice came in a second time, slow down, more emphatically. I slowed down, and a huge truck ran the red light on an intersection and narrowly missed me. If I hadn't heard that voice and hadn't acted on it, that truck would have killed me. That was the start of me thinking, well, maybe I should try and find out what this voice is and where it came from and why it saved my life. And so I spent the next 7 to 8 years researching intuition. I couldn't get the film financed. I've been quite successful at getting other films financed, but this one I couldn't get financed. And I kind of got to a bit of a blockage. And then I decided that I would walk the Camino de Santiago. And I decided that I would dedicate the walk to PGS, to this film that I wished to make. And what that meant was that I decided that I would do the Camino intuitively, which is counterintuitive to me, you know, because as a film producer and director, I'm very organized.
Yeah.
I like to plan things ahead. I like to have A plans and B plans and, backups and all sorts of things. And to walk intuitively was something that, that was actually personally very confronting and quite scary, really, to not have any plans in place. Basically, I was going to wing it and just let the Camino guide me and let my intuition guide me and so forth. So I dedicated this walk to PGS, to the film that I wished to make.
Yeah.
And I have to say, Sarah, that when I came back from the Camino changed me so much that within 6 months, I had that film up and running. Look, I can't say it more emphatically. I see my life before the Camino and I see my life after the Camino.
Yeah.
At the time, I didn't see it in such a clear division. Now, with hindsight, I do see it in a very, very clear, as you say, a line in the sand. And but it's funny, the Camino kind of creeps up on you. And one of the things that I'm doing at the moment is I've started writing a book called Bringing the Camino Back Home. Yeah, and looking at how you can possibly bring the lessons that you've learned on the Camino back into your everyday life, because that's what we all aspire to, I think. You can have this extraordinary experience on the Camino and come back, and before you know it, you're back into old habits and old ways and the hurly-burly of life and so forth, and it all becomes a faded memory. For that period of time when you're on the Camino, you don't have to worry about paying bills. You don't have to worry about emails, or really it's a bubble. Yeah. And it's kind of nice, that bubble, it's very sort of comforting, but it also can become a trap. And one of the things that I firmly believe is that the Camino can serve a purpose in that it can attune you to what's important in life, what's meaningful for you in life. I mean, it's interesting that Paul Coelho, who wrote The Alchemist, did the Camino before he wrote that book. And he says that walking the Camino, in fact, influenced him greatly in writing The Alchemist, which has become, one of the most widely read books of all time.
There was a lovely anecdote in your book which seemed to bring that significance to the fore for me, when you were standing in the cathedral in Burgos.
Yeah, that was really weird.
Yeah.
And I've since making the intuition film, it's opened up a part of me that allowed this weird stuff to happen more and more. But basically what happened was I was walking around the cathedral and I went into this little, I think what do they call them, chapels? In the center of this chapel was this star on the floor. I don't know whether I consciously stood on the star. I can't remember whether I consciously stood on it or whether, having stood on it, I realized. But then I looked up and saw that it was replicated by this star pattern in the ceiling. And I suddenly felt this rush of energy, something comes straight through from that star above, through my head. I now would call it the crown chakra. But at that point, I didn't believe in any of that stuff. And through my entire body down into the star below, kind of like a bolt of electricity.
Wow.
That was kind of like, that went straight through me, down and grounding in the star below. And I can't begin to tell you what that felt like. It kind of made me feel sort of like light.
Yeah.
It was like I couldn't move. I mean, it really was like I had sort of plugged in
extraordinary
some electric wire. And it was like, it was very, very strange.
You were told, or it was recounted to you, that there were 3 stages in the Camino.
This was told to me by an Italian fellow who I met along the way. In the book, he was called Ivan. Lovely man, absolutely gorgeous man. And we became friends. We crisscrossed throughout the Camino, and he had a great influence on me. But as we're walking towards, after, and I can't ever pronounce his name correctly, Castelleras.
Yeah.
Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, I think so.
And heading up towards the big cliff that sort of zigzags up.
Yeah.
He told me that he had been told by a priest that the Camino falls into 3 parts. The first part is birth, the second part is death, and the third part is rebirth, basically.
Yeah.
And the second part is on the Camino. On the Meseta. So he's telling me this is we're approaching, walking up onto the Meseta. To which I said, mate, if we're walking up to our death, you can go first. But a very, very strange thing happened on the Meseta. And Sarah, this comes back to years earlier when I'd been in Galicia and I was driving to Caen. I remember my wife and I driving across the Meseta, and in the distance we saw this line of pilgrims walking across the Meseta. And at the time I thought, what a stupid, meaningless, lemming-like thing to do. And here I am, I find myself walking across the Meseta and looking across and seeing cars in the distance and thinking, my God, a few years ago, I was in one of those cars looking at me, and now here I'm doing it. Strangely, when I got onto the Meseta, the knee magically kind of became fine. It ceased to hurt, it ceased to be a problem. Looking back now, I did, I think, 3 or 4 40-kilometer day pluses. I now think the Meseta defines a pilgrim. There are some people who avoid the Meseta altogether and they take transport. I found the Meseta to be the heart and soul of the Camino. It was where everything clicked into place for me. And part of the reason is because it's so long, it's so featureless, it becomes hypnotic. You're forced to look inside yourself. And with these newly acquired poles, the tick, 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 it really is meditative. If you've got wind, even though that can be very, very difficult, but the wind is a very purifying thing as well. You used the word transcendent before. I did find the Meseta absolutely transcendent. And I finished that section, I came off the Meseta probably really quite a different person to when I started the walk. One of the things that I learned from the Camino is that you don't need to live in imagined fear. The people rushing past me, and hell bent, with their heads down, hell bent just on getting a room. That's it. That's their whole sole purpose for that day, is to get a room. They're missing out on so much. And my wife encouraged me to walk the Camino. She didn't want to join me. I spoke to her on the phone every day, and she came out to Santiago at the end and met me. But she said, I hope, words were, as I was leaving, I hope when you come back from this Camino, I won't have to apologize for you anymore.
Does she apologize for you now?
I think she still does a bit, yeah. Sarah, do you know that I'm making a film of the book?
No, please tell us that.
When I reached Santiago, I was expecting an epiphany. I didn't know why I was walking the Camino. I felt compelled to walk it. I was hoping that during the walk or possibly at the end, I would have this epiphany and it would all make sense and everything would click into place. Well, that didn't happen. Arriving in Santiago was a gigantic letdown and an anticlimax. And I came back to Australia very confused. I didn't know why I had put myself through so much pain and anguish. So what I did is I decided to write this book, which I called The Way, My Way. And I hoped that the reason I wrote the book was so that I could kind of complete the Camino and hopefully work out why I had walked the Camino. Anyway, so I decided to self-publish the book because I didn't think a publisher would be interested. It very quickly got on some forums and some bloggers in the top 10 Camino books to read, and stuff like this. Before I knew it, the book was selling like crazy. Anyway, one of the people who read the book was a very highly respected Australian distributor. And he said, I think there's a movie in this. He called me up and said, I want to make a movie of this book. Will you do it? And I said, no, I don't want to make a film about myself and all the failings and, all of the, everything. And I said, I don't think it would work. And he said, well, look, I think you're wrong. I think, the book brought him to tears. It had a very profound effect on him. He said, if you can make a film about this book, then the film's going to work. And so basically, I hope to be doing that next year. It's going to feature all of the people who originally I met along the way. It's going to be a narrative, but it's going to be what's called a feature documentary. So it's going to be sort of like a dramatized documentary. But basically, you're going to follow the book.